there are 3 guided missile destroyers deploying off the coast of Venezuela.
Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro responding now by calling for a nationwide military enlistment and vowing to deploy millions of his own troops.
Hundreds of Venezuelans are answering President Nicolas Maduro's call to join the militia.
The U.S. is doubling its bounty for Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, now offering $50 million for his arrest.
It's all part of President Trump's plan to help combat drug cartels in Latin America.
A war between the United States and Venezuela is starting to look inevitable. And if this does break out, it could easily turn into the biggest and deadliest conflict of this decade. Trump has already mobilized at least 3 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, 8 nuclear-powered attack submarines, and 3 Inclease assault ships carrying roughly 4,500 U.S. personnel, including some 2,200 battle-ready Marines, now sitting off the Caribbean coast of Venezuela. In retaliation, the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, went on state TV and called on the entire nation to mobilize. Not a few thousand troops, not even a few 100,000. He claimed he would put 4.5 million civilian members of the Bolivarian militia under arms. Yeah, you heard that right. 4.5 million people. That's nearly 15% of Venezuela's entire population, supposedly ready to fight and to defend the homeland. He's calling it a special plan to cover every inch of Venezuela with patriotic fighters, from beaches to the jungles, armed with rifles and even missiles. And just to put this into context, in 3.5 years of full-scale war, Russia has mobilized a little over 1 million troops. Venezuela, without even a war underway yet, is claiming it will mobilize 3 times that number. At the same time, Maduro's government has also banned all civilian drones. Because back in 2018, he survived an assassination attempt when an explosive-laden drone went off near him during a military parade. With the US being the most advanced military in the world when it comes to drones, you can see what Kuraka is worried about. If this escalates, drone strikes are almost guaranteed to be a part of the fight. But why on earth are both of these nations going at each other this hard right now? Well, it all comes down to narco-trafficking, decades of bad blood, and yes, a whole lot of oil. But let's start with the most surreal fact, that there is literally a bounty on Venezuela's president. And not just any bounty, it's the highest publicly known reward ever offered by the US government. Washington has offered a $50 million reward for any information that could lead to Nicolas Maduro's arrest. To put that into perspective, Osama bin Laden, after 9/11, the most wanted terrorist on the planet, had half of that, just 25 million. According to Washington, Maduro is one of the world's biggest narco-traffickers. Probably the biggest. US officials allege he's working hand in glove with drug cartels to flood the American market with fentanyl-laced cocaine. You see, cocaine is a stimulant. It floods the brain with dopamine, giving that sudden burst of euphoria, confidence, and energy. Fentanyl, though? It's the opposite. It's a synthetic opioid nearly 50 times stronger than heroin, and 100 times stronger than morphine. Just 2 milligrams, something you could balance on the tip of a pencil, can kill a healthy adult. Cocaine revs up the body, fentanyl shuts it down, and when the two collide, the body has no idea how to respond. Heart racing, lungs flowing, brain misfiring, and then within minutes, breathing simply stops. That's why so many overdoses aren't really overdoses in the traditional sense. They're murder. Many people think they're doing a normal hit of cocaine, but in reality, they've just taken a lethal dose of fentanyl hidden inside. And the reason it keeps happening is because fentanyl is dirt cheap to produce. Cartels and street dealers slip it into cocaine, heroin, even counterfeit pills, because every microgram stretches the supply and fattens their profits. They know the risks. They know how little it takes to kill, but for them, it's just a few extra bucks. Drug overdoses were already one of America's leading causes of death, claiming tens of thousands of lives every year. But fentanyl has turned that epidemic into something darker, and Venezuelan cartels are using it as a chemical weapon and profiting from the very deaths it causes. That's why Trump has been so fixated on this fight. To him, narcotics, especially fentanyl and cocaine, are the silent weapons destroying American communities. So, on day 1 of his return to office in January, he signed an executive order that basically put cartels in the same legal category as Al-Qaeda or ISIS. He directed his State Department to designate the most violent cartels and gangs across Latin America as foreign terrorist organizations. labeling cartels as terrorists opens up the door for the U.S. to use the military and its intelligence agencies directly against them, with harsher penalties for anyone providing support. That means the U.S. military can officially act against them wherever these cartels operate, be it the Mexican mountains or the Venezuelan jungles. By February, 8 criminal organizations across the Western Hemisphere were formally designated as foreign terrorist organizations. Among them, Mexico's infamous Sinaloa and Jalisco cartels, the MS-13 gang from El Salvador, and yes, Venezuela's own Trinidad Araga. For Washington, Venezuelan traffickers are the biggest problem. For decades, U.S. officials have warned Caracas about the scale of drug shipments moving through its territory. And yet, every year, it's only gotten worse. So this August, the U.S. Attorney General doubled the bounty on Maduro to $50 million, citing evidence that he was actively colluding with Venezuela's own military-run drug cartel, the so-called Cartel de Nisolas, or the Cartel of the Suns, as well as Mexico's Sinaloa cartel. Together, they're accused of flooding the U.S. with fentanyl-laced cocaine, which is exactly why you now see U.S. destroyers and Marines off of Venezuela's coast. Officially, the Pentagon is calling this latest naval buildup a counter-narcotics operation. But make no mistake, this is a serious show of force, not only for the cartels, but also for the nations that secretly support them. Those warships aren't just there to stop smugglers' boats. They can conduct electronic surveillance, gather intelligence, and if ordered, launch precision strikes from the sea. The U.S. is hitting Maduro from all sides. Putting that kind of money on a leader's head doesn't just stigmatize him internationally, it sows paranoia inside his own circle. Who's loyal? Who's tempted by those millions? Could a general or even a bodyguard flip on him? That kind of paranoia eats away at a regime from the inside. When Washington first indicted Maduro on narco-trafficking charges back in 2020, he laughed it off on TV, saying the accusations make me laugh, and dismissing them as a pretext for regime change. But that's exactly the point. It's about regime change. Since 2013, Maduro has clung to power through rigged elections, banning, jailing, or exiling nearly every opposition figure who would challenge him. But the bad blood between Washington and Caracas goes far beyond Maduro. He didn't just appear out of thin air. He was the hand-picked successor of Hugo Chavez, the firebrand socialist who took power in 1999. Chavez built his entire identity on being the anti-American revolutionary of the 21st century. In fact, in 2006, he stood at the UN podium, and here's what he had to say about the US President George W. Bush. And do you know what Bush had spoken about just a day earlier? Yeah, his speech had nothing to do with Chavez. It was about civilization versus terror, a call for unity against those who use terror as a weapon to create fear. Basically the same generic post-9/11 Bush message. But to Chavez, it felt like Bush was personally calling him out in front of everyone. You see, when Chavez rose to power in 1999, he pitched himself as the heir to Simón Bolívar, the liberator of South America. And he cast the United States as a modern empire, meddling in Latin nations. Almost immediately, his Bolivarian revolution clashed with U.S. oil interests. Remember, Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world. Chavez knew the leverage that gave him. He poured billions of petrodollars into social programs that won him genuine popularity among Venezuela's poor. But he also weaponized oil as a geopolitical tool. He sold it at discounts to allies, used it to build influence in the region, and funneled profits into forging anti-US blocs. He deliberately strengthened ties with Fidel Castro's Cuba, Corte Iran, Russia, and even Saddam Hussein's Iraq, at a time when Iraq was one of America's most bitter enemies. And of course, if you poke at a superpower's interests, they'll poke back, and that's exactly what the US did to him. In 2002, he faced a coup attempt. He and his supporters accused the Bush administration of having a hand in it, and while Washington denied any direct role, US officials had met with the coup plotters beforehand, and the White House was quick to welcome Chavez's brief ouster. The problem for Washington was that Chavez wasn't gone forever. Just 2 days later, after a massive street protest and loyalists in the military rallying to him, he was back in the presidential palace, angrier and more convinced than ever. From that moment on, and for the rest of his presidency, Chavez blamed almost every problem he faced, whether it was economic chaos or street protests, on U.S. imperialism. It was his shield, his rallying cry, and the backbone of his Bolivarian revolution. When the U.S. invaded Afghanistan and Iraq, Chavez doubled down. He mocked Bush publicly, calling him Mr. Danger, and accused Washington of spreading terror under the banner of democracy. In return, Washington began treating Venezuela as a problem state. By 2005, the U.S. cut off arms sales, citing Venezuela's refusal to cooperate on counterterrorism and anti-drug efforts. In 2006, the same year as Chavez's infamous devil speech at the UN, the State Department officially declared Venezuela as a country failing its international counter-narcotics obligations. Thus began the sanctions era, and the bad blood never really cooled down after that. So by the time Nicolas Maduro inherited power in 2013, after Chavez's death from cancer, Venezuela was already on a collision course with the US. Under President Obama, the US began imposing targeted sanctions on Venezuelan officials in 2015, citing human rights abuses and corruption. Obama even signed an executive order declaring Venezuela a national security threat, a necessary legal step that allowed even harsher measures. Then came Donald Trump's first term, which took this US-Venezuela confrontation to a whole new level. Trump openly called Maduro a dictator, and he still refers to him that way to this day. He also refused to recognize Maduro's controversial re-election in 2018, which was widely condemned as fraudulent. And in January of 2019, when Maduro swore himself in for another term, Washington officially recognized opposition leader Juan Guaido as Venezuela's legitimate interim president. Washington threw its full weight behind Guaido, the young head of Congress who had declared himself interim president during mass protests. Over 50 countries quickly followed the US's lead. It was an unprecedented diplomatic strike, an open attempt to strip Maduro of legitimacy and box his government into isolation on the world stage. The White House hoped that pressure, combined with Venezuela's street protests and collapsing economy, would push Maduro out. And for a brief moment, in April of 2019, it looked like that might happen. Guaido and a handful of defecting officers tried to spark a military uprising in Caracas. Tanks rolled, crowds gathered, and for a few tense hours, it looked like a coup would finally throw him out. But the top military brass ultimately stayed loyal to Maduro, and by nightfall, the attempt had fizzled. Many in the United States wanted a direct military intervention, but Trump held it off. But he did wage an economic war instead. Starting in 2019, the US slapped Venezuela with crippling sanctions. The harshest came with an embargo on Venezuela's lifeblood, its oil. Washington froze Venezuela's US-based subsidiary oil company, Citgo, and cut off Maduro's access to its revenues, and barred American companies from trading Venezuelan crude. Allies were pressured to follow suit. Practically overnight, Venezuela lost its biggest customer, the United States, and found it nearly impossible to do business in dollars. This time, the goal was to starve the regime of cash, accelerate its collapse, and force Maduro out. The pressure did hurt. Venezuela's already shrinking economy went into a freefall. By 2020, millions of Venezuelans had fled what became the largest refugee crisis in modern Latin American history. Hyperinflation, food shortages, blackouts, the country was collapsing. And yet, Maduro survived, thanks to the loyalty of his generals and the lifeline thrown by Russia, China, Iran, and Cuba, who showed him how to slip past US sanctions via secret oil shipments, covert gold sales, and a maze of backdoor financial schemes. Lifelines that kept the regime afloat even as ordinary Venezuelans bore the cost. Frustrated, Trump's team turned to even more extreme measures. In March of 2020, the US Justice Department decided to indict President Maduro and more than a dozen top Venezuelan officials on charges of narco-terrorism. The State Department offered a $15 million reward for information leading to Adela's arrest or conviction. That was the first time Washington placed an official bounty on a sitting head of state in the Western Hemisphere. To Venezuelans, it felt surreal. Their sitting president was now formally wanted by US courts, like a fugitive. Historically, Washington had only done this once before, against Panama's Manuel Noriega in the 1980s. And in that case, the US eventually invaded. And indeed, Trump reportedly asked his military planners about the feasibility of a naval blockade. By April of 2020, the US launched a massive, enhanced counter-narcotics operation in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific. Navy destroyers, AWACS surveillance planes, Coast Guard cutters, and helicopters were deployed under Southern Command. Within weeks, the Pentagon claimed over 100 metric tons of cocaine and marijuana seized, around 1,000 traffickers arrested, and an estimated $3 billion in revenue denied to cartels and Maduro's cronies. But after several weeks of these tense patrols and intelligence operations, the show of force quietly wound down. Ships were reassigned, assets pulled back, and then, just when things seemed to calm, came Operation Gideon in May 2020. Something that sounds too crazy not to mention. If you're worried about how AI is changing everything, jobs, industries, education, even the economy, well, you're not alone. According to a Rutgers University report, 7 in 10 US workers say they're very, or somewhat, concerned about employers using AI in decision-making. 3 in 10 are worried about their job being eliminated by AI. Even experts agree. Many studies say that by the 2030s, 30% of jobs will be automated by AI, and 44% of workers replaced. That means you have to pay attention if you want to avoid becoming a victim. That's why we recently made a YouTube video that breaks down what's actually happening behind the scenes and how people are preparing. not just to survive, but to benefit from the AI revolution. And this isn't about becoming a coder or building the next ChatGPT. It's about understanding where the real leverage is as AI evolves, and how normal people are using it to build safer career paths right now. If you're feeling uncertain about the future, or you're just curious about what your options are, watch that video here on YouTube by clicking on the link in the description or on the card on your screen. In early May, about 60 Venezuelan dissidents and a couple of American ex-soldiers tried to infiltrate Venezuela by sea, planning to capture Maduro himself. The mission was led by Jordan Goudreau, a Florida-based security contractor, who claimed to have inked a deal with some opposition figures to topple the regime. They came ashore on fishing boats, only to be ambushed almost immediately. 8 insurgents were killed, dozens captured, including the 2 American ex-soldiers, both former Green Berets who are now imprisoned in Venezuela. Washington quickly denied involvement, and rightly so. The Associated Press had already exposed the plan days before, and U.S. officials had even warned Goudreau to abort the mission. But in the end, the incident was deeply embarrassing for the Venezuelan opposition and gave Maduro a propaganda field day. He went on TV declaring it proof of U.S. plots, that Washington was conspiring to assassinate him and overthrow the revolution. By the end of Trump's first term in early 2021, Maduro was still standing. Juan Guaido's so-called interim government had never managed to govern anything, and over time, the opposition fractured. Many countries that once recognized him quietly pulled back when it became clear nothing was going to change. Venezuela kept limping through an economic catastrophe, with millions more citizens pouring into Colombia, Peru, Brazil, and beyond, creating a refugee crisis on par with Syria. And yet, Maduro survived, thanks to the loyalty of his generals, whom he kept close with privileges, and thanks to lifelines from Russia, China, Iran, and Cuba. Then Joe Biden took office. He didn't like Maduro any more than Trump did. He still called him a dictator and left the core sanctions in place. But Biden preferred negotiation to brute pressure. His administration opened back-channel talks, hoping to restore at least some semblance of democracy. And when Russia invaded Ukraine in March of 2022, everything changed. Suddenly, Washington faced an oil crunch. Russian crude was sanctioned, supply was cut, and the world needed another source. And wouldn't you know it, Venezuela has the largest oil reserves on Earth. So Biden took a gamble. In March of 2022, senior U.S. officials flew quietly to Caracas to meet Maduro, the first high-level talks in years. The U.S. wanted to explore easing oil sanctions if Maduro offered political concessions. Washington's hope was to pry him away from Putin and maybe get Venezuelan oil flowing again to stabilize global markets. Maduro, sensing leverage, rolled out the red carpet. He smiled, he posed for photos with the envoys in Miraflores Palace, something unthinkable just a year earlier. But in the end, Maduro had extreme demands. He wanted all sanctions lifted and recognition of his presidency, but the U.S. wanted free elections, the release of political prisoners, and a real democratic process. So yeah, not much progress was being made. Still, the ice was broken. As a goodwill gesture, Venezuela released 2 detained Americans in March of 2022. Later, in October of 2022, Maduro freed 7 more U.S. citizens, including oil executives from Citgo, in exchange for the release of 2 of his wife's nephews. The pair, known as the narco nephews, had been convicted in a U.S. court for trying to smuggle nearly a ton of cocaine. By late 2022, the U.S. was experimenting with a different approach. The Biden administration granted Chevron, America's last remaining oil major in Venezuela, a limited license to restart pumping and exporting crude. Washington wanted to see if easing some sanctions might bring Maduro's government to the negotiating table. For Venezuela, desperate for cash and markets, it was a lifeline. For the U.S., it was leverage. For the first time in years, there was a faint glimmer that Venezuela's crisis could find an off-ramp through negotiations rather than war or collapse. The carrot of sanctions relief was on the table. Whether Maduro would ever truly bite remained the unanswered question. But by 2024, that hope slowly died on its own. Talks between Maduro and the opposition stagnated, and no one seriously believed he'd risk power in a fair vote. And indeed, when election season came, his regime banned the most popular opposition candidates and stage managed the contest on its own terms. Not surprisingly, by late 2024, Maduro declared victory for another term. Reports said the vote was neither free nor fair. Opposition leaders were still in jail or exile. The media was muzzled, and the Electoral Commission was firmly in government hands. The Electoral Authority announced his win, but never fully released results. The opposition claimed their standing candidate had actually won, and a large part of the international community backed those claims. But it didn't matter. By January of 2025, Maduro was sworn in again. The U.S., with Trump back in the White House, flatly refused to recognize Maduro's victory, just as it had rejected his 2018 re-election. In Washington's eyes, Maduro remained an illegitimate dictator who's clung to power through sham elections and repression. Any goodwill earned during the 2022-2023 truce evaporated and set the stage for an even more confrontational United States. Trump 2.0 wasted no time, and this was the moment when he finally recognized 8 Latin American criminal groups as foreign terrorist organizations, including Venezuela's own Tren de Arauca. Until recently, Tren de Arauca was little known outside the region. Born about a decade ago inside a Venezuelan prison, Tren de Arauca morphed into a massive transnational crime syndicate. They engaged in everything: drug dealing, human trafficking, extortion, you name it. Tren de Arauca spread its tentacles into Colombia, Brazil, Peru, and even into the U.S. via migrant routes. U.S. authorities say Tren de Arauca's members have been turning up in various U.S. cities, piggybacking on the waves of desperate Venezuelan migrants fleeing their country. This fits perfectly with Trump's border agenda of cracking down on the gangs and tightening the border. He repeatedly tied Venezuela's collapse to the surge of migrants arriving at the U.S. southern border. By blaming communist dictators and cartels for pushing that wave north, he framed tougher border controls and stricter enforcement as not just immigration policy, but as national security. Maduro's government, for its part, insists Washington has no evidence, claiming the U.S. simply wants regime change to control Venezuela's oil. Cartarcus claims that most illicit fentanyl flooding the U.S. comes from Mexican cartels using Chinese precursor chemicals, not Venezuela. And technically, Venezuela isn't a major fentanyl producer. What it is, though, is a convenient transit route for Colombian cocaine, and that's where the U.S.'s case against Maduro sharpens. Now, that being said, there's plenty of circumstantial evidence that Maduro's inner circle, possibly Maduro himself, has been knee-deep in the drug trade. Over the years, multiple administrating generals, including a former defense minister and ex-head of military intelligence, have been indicted by U.S. prosecutors or caught abroad in trafficking plots. Even the term Cartel of the Suns comes directly from the network of Israeli generals. In the Israeli military, high-ranking officers wear sun-shaped insignias on their shoulder epaulets to mark their rank. Over time, investigators noticed that many of the officers accused of smuggling cocaine and running protection rackets were the ones with those suns on their uniforms. That's how the nickname stuck, the Cartel of the Suns, a reference to both their military rank and their role in moving tons of cocaine through Venezuela. And then there's the family connection that I mentioned earlier. In 2015, 2 of Mendoza's own relatives, the nephews of his wife, Celia Flores, were arrested in a DEA sting in Haiti, caught trying to move 800 kilos of cocaine. They were convicted in U.S. federal court and served years behind bars before being swapped in 2022. Can anyone seriously believe the president didn't know his own family was in the trade? Even Venezuela's state-owned airport has been linked to trafficking attempts tied to the presidential family. And if that isn't rot at the very top of the regime, then what is? Which is why, once those cartels were labeled as terrorist organizations, and with Maduro accused of leading or at least protecting them, the U.S. could use harsh measures, even the threat of force, as morally justified against his regime. After all, who's going to stand up in defense of a narco-terrorist dictator? It also sidesteps the thorny sovereignty issue. If you can convince the world that your target isn't a legitimate head of state, but a mafia boss in presidential clothing, someone whose network is killing nearly 100,000 Americans a year, then operations to nab him don't look like invasions, they look like law enforcement. The U.S. played that exact card in 1989. When General Manuel Noriega of Panama was indicted on drug charges, President George H.W. Bush sent in 27,000 troops in Operation Just Cause. They toppled Noriega, dragged him to Miami, and he spent the rest of his life shuffling between prison cells. Washington would love nothing more than to run that playbook again, this time with Maduro. Lastly, being tough on Venezuela plays extremely well in Florida, home to a huge community of Venezuelan exiles and Cuban Americans who loathe socialism. Maduro, of course, is selling a very different story. To him, this is Yankee imperialism 2.0, the same old plot to seize Venezuela's oil and install a puppet regime. And yes, it's impossible to ignore oil in this story. For much of the 20th century, Venezuela was one of America's top oil suppliers. But under Chavez and Maduro, and especially after U.S. sanctions, that crude has increasingly gone elsewhere, as China, India, and through shadowy illicit channels designed to dodge sanctions. At its peak in the late 1990s, Venezuela pumped over 3 million barrels per day. By 2013, it was still around 2.3 million, but by 2020, output had collapsed to barely 500 to 800,000 barrels a day. More recently, it's roughly averaging around 8 to 900,000 barrels per day in 2023 through 2025. The industry is devastated. Only 1 or 2 drilling rigs are active in the whole country. versus more than 80 rigs a decade ago. Even if sanctions vanished tomorrow, Venezuela couldn't flood the market overnight. It would take years of investment to rebuild. Nonetheless, in a world hungry for oil and where prices have been volatile, especially with Russia's war and OPEC's moves, Venezuela's oil is an immense prize. Both the US and China and others know this. For the US, getting Venezuelan oil back into the Western supply chain would be a major win. Better to have it flowing to global markets than tied up in shady sanctioned deals with China or left underproduced by a chaotic regime. And that's exactly why, today, the only real lifelines propping up Venezuela are China and Russia, keeping Maduro's government afloat when much of the world has shut its doors. Beijing has poured tens of billions into Venezuela over the past 15 years, mostly in oil-backed loans that Caracas struggles to repay. A private Chinese company just signed a 20-year deal to produce 60,000 barrels a day by 2026, investing over $1 billion. Russia's Rosneft has also invested, often helping Caracas sell oil under the radar. So when the US suddenly beefed up its military presence off of Venezuela's coast, Beijing was merely too happy. China's energy security depends on a handful of suppliers, and Venezuela is one of them. That's why Beijing quickly issued a public warning denouncing the US buildup and insisting that no country should use, or even threaten to use, force in Venezuela's internal affairs. Sensing an opportunity, Maduro started flaunting his friendship with China more than ever. In a recent speech at a teachers' congress, he randomly whipped out a new Huawei smartphone and claimed it was a personal gift from China's president, Xi Jinping, saying he can now talk to Brother G via satellite phone whenever he wants. With a grin, Maduro even did a goofy ni hao xie xie, which means hello, thank you, in Mandarin into the phone. It was indeed goofy, but still a message that China has its back. Just this past week, China's ambassador in Caracas met with Maduro to celebrate progress in their partnership. Maduro himself boasted on social media about advances in economy, science, technology, and artificial intelligence, along with what he called Venezuela's sister China. But then again, realistically speaking, China's support, while real, has limits. After barely weathering Trump's tariff war, and with its own economy struggling to regain momentum, China has no appetite for a direct clash with Washington over Venezuela. So yeah, China will strongly oppose US intervention in principle, protest diplomatically, and perhaps quietly boost trade with Venezuela, but they won't physically intervene on Venezuela's behalf. As for Russia, well, that's pretty obvious. Moscow is bogged down in Ukraine, bleeding resources and focus. But Russia also has military cooperation with Venezuela. In past years, they've sent bombers to land in Caracas, run joint exercises. And Moscow has an interest in poking the US where it can. Right now, Russian officials might privately encourage Maduro to stand firm. And Russia may even try to funnel military gear to Venezuela if needed. And if the US seriously escalates, Russia could use Venezuela as a bargaining chip. Something like, well, we'll step back in Venezuela if you step back in Ukraine. After all, Venezuela is one of the few cards Russia holds in the Western Hemisphere. If tensions truly escalated, then a war in Venezuela could be a prolonged and ugly one. Venezuela has nearly 30 million people, and while its regular military has been weakened by years of corruption and neglect, it's still sizable, around 100,000 personnel, with special forces, armored units, and air defenses. And then there's Maduro's claim of 4 to 5 million militia members. Realistically, the true number of armed active militia may be much lower, but even a fraction of 4 million could complicate any foreign intervention. Add to this the Colombian guerrilla groups like the ELN, who operate freely inside of Venezuela with the government's blessing, and you start to see how messy things could really get. This wouldn't be Iraq in 2003, where US forces rolled into Baghdad in a matter of weeks. Caracas is a dense, sprawling capital, and a war there could mean drawn-out insurgencies, brutal urban combat, and the kind of street-by-street fighting that grinds armies down. And beyond the battlefield, the humanitarian cost would be staggering. Millions of more refugees would pour across Venezuela's borders into Colombia, Brazil, and beyond, straining neighbors already overwhelmed by the exodus. So, is Washington really prepared to go that far? Probably not, at least not yet. The current deployment of destroyers and an attack submarine looks more like preparation for a blockade or a quarantine. Maybe limited strike operations against cartel or military targets, supported by drones and surveillance assets. On the other hand, Maduro might go all in on asymmetrical tactics. His government has relationships with various non-state actors. For instance, Venezuela maintains ties with Colombian rebel groups, and there are alleged links to Lebanese Hezbollah operatives in Venezuela. In a nightmare scenario, if Maduro truly thought he was about to be taken out, he or his allies could sponsor disruptive activities, anything from cyber attacks to stirring unrest in neighboring countries, or in a far-fetched but not impossible scenario, facilitating a terrorist attack against US interests as revenge. This is speculative, but when leaders feel existentially threatened, they often reach for desperate measures. And all the while, it's ordinary Venezuelans who pay the price. They've already endured years of hyperinflation, blackouts, food shortages, and repression. The last thing they need is their country becoming the battlefield of a proxy war, or worse, a direct one. Some Venezuelans even joke darkly that maybe an American invasion could at least bring dollars and jobs, but behind that humor is exhaustion. So where does this leave us? Honestly, right at the edge, there are still diplomatic off-ramps. Intermediaries like France, Spain, and some Latin American states have floated the idea of internationally monitored elections in exchange for easing sanctions and dropping the bounty. Even the Vatican, which has mediated before, may be trying to cool things down. Maduro himself recently hinted he was open to dialogue. In the coming weeks, we'll see if those U.S. warships off Venezuela's coast are truly readying for an invasion or simply pieces on a chessboard, meant to intimidate, to squeeze, to remind Maduro that his time may be finally running short.